fact, I am a child of Somerville in a certain kind of way. I lived here from 2001 to 2010. Yeah. I came right at the moment that Cambridge ended their rent control, and Somerville got flooded with people who could no longer afford Cambridge, and all the prices shot up in Somerville. And it was the only place we could actually afford to live. I was teaching at Boston College. And so we had to come all the way over here, which is fine. I love Somerville. I love Somerville, the time I spent here. I lived on Governor Winthrop Road. And so right off the water, right off the Mystic. My kids who are now, my kids who are now 20, 17, and 13. My oldest was 3, and we used to run on that, at the time, beaten path. I'm sure it's been revitalized since. But it's glad, I'm happy to be back and to talk to you about universities and their relationship to their communities. This comes out of my work. It just recently came out in March of this year, entitled "In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower: How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities." And in this work, I offer a forensic diagnosis of what's been going on over the last at least 50 years, if not the last century. But also, I don't just end on critique. I offer us a way out that is grounded in the revolutionary period of the 1960s and 70s that you talk about, but rooted in African-American, Latinx social movements, student groups around campuses that offered us solutions and plans and visions for equity with universities, and saw universities not just these centers of higher learning, but as gateways to communities. And so in the work, I try to revive that idea and point to places in the country today where we see bits and pieces of that ethos, but pushing towards a more robust statement. So I love that you guys are doing the work on pilot. I speak about the pilot program in Boston, in Massachusetts. That was started as a Boston program that was voluntary. And then during the pandemic, it went to the State House, and we as a state are trying to make it statewide and mandatory. And I applaud you for that. So that is in the book. We discussed that. But it's also surrounded by a claim and understanding that pilots are not enough. That if we just talk to universities simply from the perspective of, you owe us this, you owe us that, it's never going to work. Universities are these vibrant, they have the capacity to be these vibrant engines of development and growth in ways that are equitable and just. They aren't doing it that way. We want universities to stay. We want them to have an equitable and just and humane relationship with the cities that make them possible and that allow them to grow. Yeah. So there must be a community-based approach that goes simply beyond pilots. I mean, for example, in my backyard, you mentioned I was with the New Haven folk, the New Haven Rising, a great organization that connects residents and students and community members and most community members that are workers on campus through Unite Here, the local labor groups. And that's right, local. So it's important to understand that, but they also understand that Yale offers the biggest pilot in the country at $14 million. That's significant. But that is on now, after the pandemic, a $42 billion endowment. So it's a little bit less significant. So we must have a comprehensive understanding of the various ways in which the tentacles of the Ivory Tower work their ways into our communities that go simply beyond tax abatement. That's a powerful and wonderful entry point. But if we just simply attack that, schools will be allowed or will be open to offering pilots. But that will just touch one fraction of the ways in which they touch our lives. So I want to talk a little bit to you this evening about this larger framework I'm talking about. So whether you know it or not, but you should, it's important for you to know that right before our eyes, colleges and universities, both public and private, have become the biggest employers, real estate holders, healthcare providers, and policing agents in major cities and college towns all across our country. For example, NYU and Columbia are two of the biggest landholders on the island of Manhattan. At one point, number 2 and 3 on the island, just behind the Catholic Church. The University of Southern California is the largest private employer in the county of Los Angeles. The University of Chicago holds the second largest security force in the world, only behind the Vatican City, with jurisdiction over 50,000 non-student residents on the city's south side. So with that kind of influence, we understand a certain responsibility. We've allowed that kind of influence to take shape because of the expectation that, well, colleges and universities, they have the capacity to bring ideas and people together and generate all types of innovations that can be an engine for our cities. We concede that. We believe that. We understand that. And we see developments like USC Village, Harper Court, Dorchester City Bay. We see the partnership between Virginia Tech and Amazon in Northern Virginia. We see these developments of these magisterial developments of glass and steel. We think, okay, that's amazing. That is great. We need that. In the world without factories, we need some kind of economic revitalization. And if higher education can serve that purpose, then why not? In the process, though, we have witnessed higher education's growing control over the economic development and, in support for you all, the urban governance of our cities. What I call the rise of the universities. So in short, our cities, universities have become today's companies. And our cities and towns have become their company towns. And there is a cost to those who live in the shadows. There's a cost to those who live in the shadows. For example, at the point of university development and expansion, we see rising housing costs for both homeowners and also renters, sometimes beyond their means, which leads to displacement and removal and what we might call gentrification. We see that with higher education's growing control over the labor market, that it is colleges and universities that dictate and control the wage ceiling, not just for the campus, but for the entire city. And in some cases, they suppress collective bargaining efforts, especially when they shift their labor from direct contracts to subcontractors that are not subject to the agreements bartered and bargained for by the local labor organizations. And then we also find that those very same residents that live and work in those neighborhoods face greater surveillance at the hands of campus police, whether they are public or private schools, that are increasingly holding public authority. Many of them carry guns. They have public jurisdiction over non-student residents. But if they are private schools, they are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act laws. So they have been sanctioned with public authority without public scrutiny. So I just want you to take that all in for a minute. The various ways in which higher education has pervaded our lives that have nothing to do with teaching classes or research laboratories. This is a vital understanding of our new phenomena. So the question that must come to you all this evening is, how did our cities become a campus? How did our cities, right before our eyes, become a campus? And what does it mean for our public good? Whether a public school or private school, what does it mean when the governing structures, the economic priorities, the built environment of our neighborhood blocks are reorganized in ways to serve the interests of higher education? When our cities become a campus. So first of all, how did we get here? There's a long history, but I'm going to give you the short one. At least around in the 1950s, we faced what people have called white flight in our urban environments. Some people say white flight, which actually is a misnomer because white folks in the cities weren't flying away from cities. They were chasing capital, factories, wealth, moving to the suburban areas, and they were the ones who were allowed to follow. Black and brown folks, because of the covenants that were built into housing developments and the restrictions that were built into neighborhoods, were not allowed to follow the capital. So universities, not as nimble as individual families, had to sit in cities. What were they going to do? They saw all around them the ramping up of Black and brown communities that were divested, so also Black and brown poverty all around them. So they lobbied the federal government to engage in making universities the friendly face of urban renewal. So the Housing Act of 1949 has a nice little, neat little a clause in it that allows universities to get double the money for any project, cities to get double the money for any project tied to a university. So as schools as diverse as University of Pennsylvania, NYU, Columbia, all the way to the University of Colorado at Boulder, so public and private schools, demolish whole city blocks to create security around their campuses as the racial and economic demographic of cities changed in the 1950s and 60s. So they were bunkered in campuses amidst what was called the urban crisis. Flash forward to the 1990s. The children of suburban sprawl are beginning to look back to the city, what was literally called the back to the city movement. I was in New York in 95 during Giuliani's reign and his horrible quality of life campaigns, jailing squeegee washers, putting young people in jail who took up more than one seat on a train, people who spent too much time in an ATM vestibule, clearing ground for these children of suburban sprawl to come back into our cities. Also underwriting tech startup companies, design companies, converting warehouses into high-end housing, converting medical sanitariums, kicking out people that were mentally ill to make way for luxury housing. So individual cities were competing with each other for this returning tax base. That's one side of the story. On the other side of the story, both public and private schools, yes, even Harvard, they receive public money. But this becomes the beginning of the end of robust public funding, the beginnings of austerity. So the state budget for public and private schools is grossly shrinking. So just to recap, on one side, you've got new urbanites in cities trying to compete for them to come back into our cities. And you've got universities trying to figure out new ways to generate revenue with losses from state expenditures. There's a convergence here. When suburbanites are coming back to the cities and they're thinking about an urban life, what's on their mind? River walks, fully wired networking, museums, libraries, what do you say?
Public transit.
Public transit. So in short, their idea of urbanity of the city was a campus. So you have this powerful interest convergence between the interests and needs of city developers, city leaders, and the interests and needs of universities, and they converge around thinking about the Ivory Tower as the new smokestack of America's 21st century economy. How does that work? There's a key word here that we call the knowledge economy. And you probably should know it very well in Boston because it's what's driving your economy today. Whether you work in a laboratory or you clean it, the knowledge economy has become the primary driver in most cities across the country. What is the knowledge economy? The knowledge economy is whereby academic research is being used to produce lucrative goods and patents in a range of fields, from pharmaceuticals, Moderna, Pfizer, thing, right? Pharmaceuticals, software industries, and military defense weaponry, just to name a few, where this research is being generated in universities, sold on the market to private companies for intellectual property, and then the royalties from that work is coming back to the university. This is a major economic engine in cities all across the country, either through direct research or through the ancillary industries that surround it, in terms of everything from the restaurants of the researchers, to the cleaning crews, to the waste management organizations, to the biohazard companies. Almost every one of you right now is touched by this knowledge economy, either directly or indirectly. What's come with that is that there's got to be, in these previously depressed areas, there's got to be a way to lure people back into these communities. So if you're in Chicago, it's hard to get people to come back to the south side of Chicago. If you are northeastern, how are you going to get folks to live in Roxbury? Just to make it very clear. If you are in Dorchester and UMass Boston, how are you going to get folks to live in Dorchester? You build out these things that have been called knowledge communities that package together residential life, retail, nightlife, commerce, entertainment in these faux urban locales that I talked about earlier, USC Village, Dorchester City Bay. I'm sure you see small versions of this around Somerville, or they will be online soon enough. But the powerful thing about these knowledge communities is because they are tied to higher education and they are churning out for-profit wealth. Because they are university related, they receive and benefit from higher education's tax exempt status. Right? So some of the most profitable industries in our country and in our cities are makeshift tax shelters for higher education institutions and their private partners. This happens in at least three ways: land, labor, and policing. First, land. One of the key ways in which universities and colleges are able to do the business they do without much scrutiny is the presumption that they offer us a public good, just simply by offering higher education. We presume that whatever they do was for educational purposes. It must be for the public good. But that also has a financial component to it. Because of the presumption that higher education is a public good, it's been designated as a nonprofit by our tax code. It is, I'm sure you know this, it is designated as a 501c3 institution, which makes all of its properties tax exempt. That is egregious on its own, but as universities become real estate companies and are buying up more and more property, it's not so much that they have so many land holdings, it's what goes on that land. That these land holdings have become knowledge factories for the kind of research for science, technology, and design that I've been talking about. So they therefore, the for-profit money that's generated on these campuses, in these knowledge communities, in these campus expansions, it is underwritten by the tax exemption. So imagine if you are a company that is doing pharmaceutical work and you are affiliated with a university, and then you are a pharmaceutical company in the same town and you are not affiliated with a university. Who can sell their services at a lower cost? The one that's tied to a tax abatement. The one that is affiliated with higher education. The one whose laboratories are on university campus blocks. In the historically Black neighborhood of Witherspoon-Jackson, a few years ago, in 2016, they saw that all of their property values were going up. So these are primarily homeowners, but also renters. And they also saw that rental costs were skyrocketing, but there weren't many improvements in the town. And they realized that they sat next to Princeton University laboratories. And they realized that the reason why there was all of this increased property tax and increased rental costs is because the laboratories were raising property values all within the neighborhood because they were producing for-profit research in these laboratories, and the money that they were generating was bypassing the town and going directly to the coffers of the university. They ended up winning an $18 million lawsuit because of the losses in taxes that were supposed to go to things like secondary schools, snow removal, trash removal. You know, think about Texas a couple of months ago, repairing or maintaining the electrical grid, right? There was a direct correlation between the impoverishment of towns and cities that have these prosperous campuses in them and the taxes that they aren't paying to the cities. The very services that underwrite and support towns and cities comes from the taxes that higher education and other nonprofits don't pay. So that's one piece, but it's not the only piece. Think about labor for a minute. In these knowledge community buildings, you have young researchers, graduate students. They have a bachelor's degree in biochemistry or computer science or what have you, or psychology, like psychopsychology. And if they went into the market, they're a graduate student, they receive a stipend of about $20,000 maybe. If they're organizing, they might get 25. With the same degree, they could go into the private market and maybe get a starting salary of $60,000. They produce enough research over the next 5 years, their salary rises to $100,000. But if they are that graduate student, they get that stipend of $20,000. They produce some research that produces value and wealth in the private market that comes back to the city, to the university. 5 years later, they're still receiving that what? That same $20,000 stipend. Make sense? Sound familiar? Yes. So these partnerships on these campus buildings that are tax exempt, they provide a phenomenal benefit to the private partner in this arrangement, because the private partner like Google, Bombardier, General Motors, Moderna, what have you, Lyrica, they can write off their donations to the school as an educational purpose tax exemption. And they get the top research and development in the world, and they pay peanuts for it. The university receives that money. They can pay for the principal investigator and their graduate students. And then they can put a bunch of the money into the amorphous category of overhead costs. So the private partner gets paid, the university gets paid, the student gets the shaft under the name of being an apprentice, even though they're doing for private market lucrative work. That doesn't even speak to what's becoming the increasingly Black and brown low-wage workers, but not only, Black and brown low-wage workers who keep universities running. Food services, buildings and grounds, maintenance, support staff, construction. If they aren't supported by a union contract, their benefits end every 3 months out of every year in the summertime. Their wages are reduced because they don't work, supposedly, for 3 months in the summer. And even if they're protected, that protection is waning because more and more of the low-wage labor force on campuses is being subcontracted, where those companies are not subjected to the contracts that are bargained by labor organizing. So that's labor. Finally, policing. 75% of colleges and universities, both public and private, have police forces, not public safety units, police forces. 9 in 10 are armed, and about 85% have jurisdiction beyond the campus. Especially in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods where there are predominantly white institutions, what this has meant is a two-tier policing system. The students, if the student and the resident commit the same infraction, the student is adjudicated by the student dean of students, and the resident goes through the criminal justice system. Right? And then again, I said before, if it's a private university, whatever they're doing doesn't have to be reported, because as a private entity, they're not subject, like Tufts, they're not subjected to the Freedom of Information Act laws. So the point here is that all this wealth generation through tax abatement, suppression of wages on these campus blocks is further surveilled and policed and protected by the police forces. You might say, well, what about public safety? What about crime? Campus police are not in the business of crime reduction. They're reactionary. And I have many friends who work as campus police. I'm not attacking the actual workers. I'm talking about the system of policing. Their job is not to police to reduce crime. Their job is to protect the university brand. Because think about it. What are two of the biggest crimes on campuses? Sexual violence and substance abuse. Campus police do a horrible job on both accounts. You might say, why? Well, is it capacity? I would say no. Is it by design? I would say yes. Because what university wants to publicize to the world that they have a campus full of white criminals? Right? So to protect the brand and the wealth generation on these campuses and the extraction of wealth through the tax abatement of the surrounding communities, the police force's function is to surveil, protect, and manage public image of the university brand in the private marketplace. That's their job. Their job is not to reduce crime. They're not preventative. They're reactionary. And that might be an observation on policing in general. That's another conversation. But the point here is that the university campus is a microcosm for a whole host of issues that we face as cities and towns across the country. But there are solutions. You mentioned one, the pilot program. Massachusetts is a pioneer, in Boston in particular, and because pilots are voluntary. In every state constitution, universities, some universities are older than the states themselves. Harvard is older than the state of Massachusetts. Yale is older than the state of Connecticut. So they have their tax abatement written into the state constitution. But even if they aren't, as nonprofits, all schools, if they give money, it's only on a voluntary level. So for a number of years, Boston tried a voluntary system. If you have properties valued at more than $15 million, please, would you give 25%? No schools did that. Didn't even come close. So now during the pandemic, activists are saying, not only are we asking for 25%, but we want to make it mandatory statewide. That's one possibility. That's one solution. But we cannot stop just at pilots. I'll be real quick here. I've created out of my research a smart cities lab because of all the research that I've done all over the country. And so we research and consult on best practices for building equitable urban communities with a particular focus on university-driven development. So with this work, with this research, I was going to make it a clearinghouse, just to watch and see what was going on and just share information. But during the pandemic, activists all over the community, people reached out online, on Twitter, and said, listen, we don't just want observations, we need advocacy. So right now, I'm working with the Black Baldwin tribe in West Philadelphia, who has been, this community has been ravaged by the convergence of UPenn, Drexel, and the University City Corporation that rocked that neighborhood in the 50s and 60s, that urban renewal policy I told you about earlier. Right now, there is one affordable housing unit available. Sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry. I'll get back in the screen. Sorry. I got excited. There is one affordable housing unit available. It's called University City Townhouses. But that is online to be demolished. So we did some research and found out that in the original plan for University City, because of community and student activism, there was an agreement that had been agreed to by all the universities to create the area where it would be a mixed area of affordable housing and research and development. That never happened. The only affordable housing development in the area was the townhouses, which are now being demolished. So we are demanding the University City Corporation to live up to its original agreement from the 1969 moment. We have the partnership with Councilperson Jamie Gauthier, who has jurisdiction over that area. And she's putting forward a plan right now to make the University City Corporation live up to its original policy. So research matters. It's not just Ivory Tower work. Sometimes you can find the receipts, because many times there was, as he pointed out in the 70s, there was student activism, there was community activism, and there were agreements and concessions that have been broken and promises not met. So we need to do that work. Recently, I was reached out by community members in Berkeley, California. We think of Berkeley as kind of being a hippy-dippy republic, but we don't understand the role of Cal Berkeley in being a rapacious land hoarder in that town for the last 50 years. Quiet as it's kept because of its activism in the city. Berkeley has one of the strongest rent control protections for a city in the country. But there's a clause in the state constitution that demonstrates that if a university purchases a property in any town, their authority usurps any municipal protections. So Berkeley decided to buy a rent-controlled building at 1921 Walnut Street. And when they did that, that activated the elimination of rent control protections. So I'm working with them to fight against that. There are lawsuits going on right now, conducting research to deal with those things. So having said, these are two examples, but as solutions, pilots, we can call for community benefits agreements on any and all developments that go on in these areas. That can include zip code specific job training or job inclusive. It can include affordable housing in any university development project, not at 80% AMI, because in Boston, 80% AMI is still unaffordable. We know that. But at 30% AMI, 40% AMI, right? build out community centers with a community benefits agreement. We can do this and activate this by creating community-based planning and zoning boards. I found in New York that Community Board 2 and 9 both disagreed with NYU and Columbia's expansion into neighborhoods, but the community boards are only advisory. They don't have legislative power. So we need community planning boards that have veto power to oversee these projects. And neither one of those neighborhoods were against